Yeah, so the question is the reason they picked 6 months because of the cost issues? And I would think no, actually it's not. Apart from Derek Humphrey, most of the people are not candid with their hand about that issue. They picked 6 months because it was an arbitrary limit that was tied into Medicare coverage for end-of-life care and hospice and that kind of thing. At one time, doctors were prosecuted if they put somebody in hospice and they lived, or the hospice was seen as being fraudulent if they lived more than the 6 months, and now they've gotten rid of that contraption. The whole idea of doctors being able to predict things is specious. You just can't do it. There's no class in medical school, I can attest to this, that is in crystal ball reading. So we can't predict. The doctors are pretty good about predicting how long somebody has to live when they have 2 weeks or less to live. The closer to death, the better we get. Kind of like the weatherman, I mean, really. I mean, did they predict all that cold weather? I mean, I don't think so. Not 3 weeks in advance. But they predict global warming in 5 years, Why doctors? I just showed you that the most expert person I know is George Amy, who's a lawyer, by the bedside in over 40 cases now. Why just overdoses of sleeping pills? What if you're disabled and you can't swallow? Why shouldn't we allow, under the American Disabilities Act, to have injections? Now, I don't want all these things, but I'm raising these questions because I want people to have to acknowledge the hypocrisy of their arbitrary limits. Yeah, there's a question. Yeah. Derek is actually, thanks, the very point is that suicide is not illegal. There's not one state of the 50 that makes suicide illegal. So this is actually bringing doctors into it when we don't need to be brought into it. Unfortunately, my patients are all too successful. That's why I have to be working overtime to try to keep them safe from themselves sometimes, whether they're 35 years old or 55, because I see depression literally every single day. So that's one important point that you made. The other point is Derek Humphrey happens to be one of the people. That's why you don't see him in the limelight, because he's not as effective, because he's honest. He believes that people ought to have the right to kill themselves at any age, really, and as do other people, yeah.
I've seen Jack Kevorkian.
Well, it's a great point you bring up, several of them, because Jack Kevorkian is actually where I first thought about this question about why only 6 months to live. He was the one that made the point. So I learned that from Jack. He does know Jack. And the reality is he's more consistent. He's not a kook. In fact, when I was interviewed by Morley Safer about this, he says he didn't want to talk about Kevorkian at that time in 60 Minutes. And so I said, well, hold it, Morley. He's very consistent. And I told him all these things about how he's very consistent about his message. I said, Morley, you're the one who's inconsistent. He didn't air that part of it. But, why not injection? There's lots of questions we can ask. Is it in violation of the American Disabilities Act? It is. In fact, the Oregon Assistant Attorney General said that it's just as much. And we could fix it, of course, by doing what? Making injections legal, yeah. Yeah, we do. We could go into that. But I think the reality is it's the minority, unfortunately, that have taken a clear stance. We're not going to go there. We're not going to do it. And, in fact, one of my friends whose father wanted to end his life came up here from San Francisco and basically the hospice that he was in said, you can't do it in our hospice. And so then they had the difficulty of, where is he going to do this thing? And so he couldn't do it in the hospital. The hospital had drawn the line in that regard. He couldn't do it in hospice because this was a clear hospice. We know people do this, but we're not going to be a part of it. You can't go into an inpatient hospice or whatever. So they do exist, but they're the minority that have been that clear. The other thing is the Final Exit Network, you all may have heard about it, but it's the one that's gone to Georgia, it's been arrested, and people are actually ending the lives of people, not necessarily that are even terminal. And would you condemn this if you were the promoter of assisted suicide? Well, you would if you were saying you really believed in these limits. But what did Barbara Coombs-Lee say about this? She's the mother, if you will, of the Oregon law. If there's any condemnation to be dished out, let it be directed toward the lawmakers who turn their backs on the prolonged suffering of patients. In other words, she turns it around and says the evil people are the people prosecuting those who broke the law, lay people, assisting people to kill themselves, which is clearly against the law in Georgia. What did Derek Humphrey say? Well, he can't say much because he's on the board of directors, the advisory board of the Final Exit Network. So it's just interesting. I want to give you hope. Pushback is underway. I sent an email to one of the leaders of the Not Dead Yet group, Diane Coleman, praising her for her ongoing work, and she sent me back a note saying, thanks, Bill. And it's really nice to see people who are probably the strongest spokespeople for the threat to them personally are the disabled. And Diane Coleman and her colleague Stephen Drake are among the strongest spokespeople because they know that this whole idea of my life not being worth living applies to the disabled community in spades. There is the exposure of the truth. I just talked about Barbara Wagner, Michael Freeland, the like. Where are we? I hope I conveyed to you cost pressures are real. I have all kinds of people, including a patient I just saw yesterday for the first time in a couple of years. He's a young guy. He's got a couple kids. He's going to limit his family. But he also said, well, I just think we got to stop spending so much money on the older people. And he just lets us slip like it's no big deal. You know, it's just, I think we just got to stop having so many Jewish people around. I mean, what are they saying? I mean, I wish I had a mirror say, do you really what you just said? You're talking about my mother-in-law who's 85. That's what you're talking about. When you cut $500 billion, that's trillion with a T, from Medicare, a program that's already going broke, what does it mean to the people who are beneficiaries of Medicare? It's that curve I showed you. This is what I'm saying. So this is not a political statement, by the way. This is simply talking about the utilitarian logic that has become a dominant force here, and that's it. So we are here. We are pushing back. I think that we have made great grounds. Canada, that I just shared with you, the exciting news of having defeated assisted suicide is there. And it's these vignettes, it's these stories that are converting hearts. And that's, I want to encourage you all. There's a little display out there. There's a pledge. You all have doctors, right? Who doesn't have a doctor here? So you all have doctors. Do you know where your doctor stands? So you can take the pledge and show it to your doctor as a concrete act and say, where do they stand on this stuff? And maybe it's time for you to have a discussion, a dialogue. Maybe that doctor needs to be find a different patient than you. So I just encourage you to do that. I think we're close to the end. Do you have any further questions? I leave you with any burning thoughts? Yes. Is the Pope Catholic? So the question is, I'm in a minority. I am, but at the same time, I'm very encouraged because there's so many people that come up and they're glad for what I say. They have at least some perspective. Universities used to be about a place for open discussion about different points of view. So one of my strongest comebacks when people say, you know, you can't be saying this, you're a minority. I say, yes, I'm a minority. I thought we honored diversity here. Could we give a little air to a minority opinion here? Or are we going to make judgments? It's very important to recognize, one, you're a minority, but there's a strength in that. And I don't think we should be disheartened when you're in certain theaters where you're the only person there speaking to the Pharisees and the Sadducees about whatever you believe about the resurrection, you know. You just got to get them fighting each other then, you know. I think that's what it said, right? Any other thoughts? At any rate, yes, go ahead.
I just wondered if you thought that
Well, I think that the ultimate problem is actually before either of those two, is that I make the decision. I'm the God with a little g about life. It's radical autonomy, which of course ultimately is chaos, and I think that's it. And you go back even before abortion. We just celebrated the 50th anniversary. This is against national right to life, perhaps, but it's become my conviction is that we took choice well before the abortion issue with the issue of contraception. And one by one, we've decided who lives and who dies, who's going to be open to life and who's not. And that'd be a whole discussion by itself of what are the things that people who actually have a real conviction about the inherent value of life, but it's across the full spectrum. That's a very different answer than you get from Diane Coleman or Stephen Drake, who really want to focus only on assisted suicide. And yet I see the mentality as being much broader. And it's also something I think you have to pick and choose when you talk about those things, because if I'm talking to a reporter about end of life, I want to focus on what the issues are there and not let them drag me into a whole different area that I do have feelings about, but it's not the topic of the day. That's the point. So it's a very good question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.